and that's by delving into this subject. How many people here have heard about this case at all? All right, how many people have no idea what this is about? Okay, good. So it's surprisingly, neither did I. Okay, and I did not start out. I just want to give you a brief introduction of how I got into this. A good friend of mine, Linda Zimmerman, and I were coming back from Albany. She was working on a book. We had talked about me doing some true crime books. And where we had been in Albany was Cherry Hill. There was a very big murder there in 1827, a hanging. And I thought, well, that's a good case to start with. It's kind of juicy. So as I was working on this case, I was reading a decision by the judge in 1827, or 1829, excuse me. And in it is a reference to this 1818 murder in Orange County, where Martin Van Buren's the prosecutor and two guys hanged. And I'm like, how did I not ever hear about this? So I thought, let me look into this a little bit. And then all of a sudden now I'm looking at two different cases. And who's done historical research here? Anybody? I've coined a new phrase. It's called attention deficit historical research disorder. Because it went from 1 or 2 cases to 3 to 4 to where I have like 5 of them I'm trying to research at any given moment. And the problem is you start reading the newspaper on one, and there's that little blurb that catches your attention, and the next thing you know, you're like completely off on another tangent. So that's one of the reasons why it's taken so long. But I began looking into this around the fall of 2009. And we're going to go back to Orange County in 1818. And I've been digging into the details because, from my perspective, you know, anybody can write down, okay, this is when it happened, this is who did it, this is what the outcome was, and that's interesting enough, but it's kind of boring also. I wanted to really delve into, where did this happen? What were the real details? What went on behind the scenes? And what about some of the legends that were associated with this case that we're going to talk about? You know, are they true? You know, where do they come from? Especially the one about the stakes driven into the graves, which I think is the cause. So we're going to talk about, that's actually from one of the publications of the time. That's why it looks like that. So we're going to go back to Sugar Loaf, 1818. And we're going to look at some of the players here, so everybody knows who we're talking about. This gets a little complicated because there's interrelationships between the players. So if anybody gets confused, yell at me, and I'll back up because it took me a while to figure out who is who. I had to write it down on paper in the beginning. It's like, well, that's that relative, that's this family member. But it all centers around Richard Jennings, who at about this time is a 70-year-old man. He does not have a good reputation. He's miserly. He is suing people constantly in court over land, especially his own family members. The publications of the time that write about this guy who's a murder victim don't say nice things about him. So imagine the paper today writing an article about someone murdered and then going on to tell you what a terrible person he was. It's a completely different world that we're talking about, 1818 versus today. But that's who the murder victim is. Well, James Teed is one of our culprits, and his wife Hannah. He is Richard's nephew. Okay, so James Teed is Richard's nephew. His wife is named Hannah. Her brother is David Conklin. So is everybody kind of following the relationships here? Victim. We're going to go back here. Hold on. Let me get back to my. Wait. Why is that not going backwards? Okay. Victim. Victim's nephew. Wife's brother. So there's a lot of interrelationship here going on. Our other players that pop up into this story is David Dunning. He's not from the area, but he's a very close friend of Teed. He lives with them, and he works with Teed, you know, taking care of the land. And probably the most fascinating character is Jacob or Jack Hodges. He's a former English sailor. He's an African American. He's a drunk. The papers are not nice to describe him. He's described as ignorant, you know, intemperate, but also described as having a great memory. And that's important in this case. But he's intensely loyal to Conklin. He works for him, very loyal. And he's also not from Orange County. In fact, he's not even sure where he's from. He's not sure he's from Philadelphia or Lancaster. Depends on which report you look at. So here's the family ties again, just so everybody's clear. Because I have to, every now and then I have to remind myself. Teed's from a well-known family in Orange County. They're farmers. They're considered at that time to be all right. They're probably not wealthy, but they're doing okay. The Conklings are also another big name. Anybody heard of Conklingtown Road in this area?
Conkling Farms, too.
Well, that was his family. His farm was on where Conklingtown Road is today. So this was a family that was around, and his wife, Fanny, this David Conkling, had a wife, right? This is on its own. His wife was from a really good family too, the Knights. And a lot of these families are still around today. And there may be people in this room, and there actually is one person in this room, I'm not going to talk about it yet, but who may have, you'd be descendants of different families here, the Knights, the Conklings, the Teeds, because these were Orange County families that are probably still around today. So let's talk about the crime. It's described as being sensational at the time. It would be sensational if it happened today, there's no doubt. But it all starts over an ongoing dispute over a woodlot. And originally, James Teed, his mother, inherits this piece of land, and Richard Jennings ends up getting it. James Teed, of course, feels swindled. He sues in court, he gets the land. Richard Jennings, he's not happy, guess what? Brings him back to court. He ultimately gets a decision, the land is now his. But Teed still has possession until the end of the year. So there's going to be like a month or two in 1818 where Richard Jennings, even though he's going to get the land back, Teed still has it in his possession. And what's Teed going to do, of course? He is going to take everything off the property he can. He's going to take as much wood, he's going to go up to the wood lot, he's going to cut it, just to irritate Jennings as much as possible. All over a stupid piece of land. So over this year now, and this doesn't, going back to the murder, this doesn't just start a couple days before the murder. For a course of a year, they talk about how the world would be better if he's dead. And how someone ought to kill him. And why can't they just pay somebody to kill him? Because of all the misery and heartache that he's causing. So it's building up to the point where now he's reclaiming the land, and he's being very stingy because he knows Teed, Conkling, and Dunning, and Hodges are going up there taking wood. And apparently he's not happy about that. It's his lot, he wants it back. Well, they come to this big conclusion, old Dick Jennings must die. And once he regains possession, that was it. They were determined then. They were going to end up, some way this guy's going to die. You know, even though he's 70 years old, even the judge says basically, you know, he's probably going to die in a couple years anyway. All you did was hasten it a little bit. But they come up with a big plot. They teach Jack, remember the drunken sailor, how to shoot a musket. And they even show him how to reload it if he has to. So you've got to remember, back then in those days, the muskets were big, long rifles. They shot one round. Probably, I can figure, a ball around that big, by about 1/4 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch. So they weren't very accurate, but up close they were very, very deadly. You know, they caused a lot of damage. So on around the 18th, James Teed leaves for New York. He goes to New York City for unspecified business. Hannah Teed, in the meantime, continues to supply Jack with unlimited alcohol. He's basically just kept in a stupor. Now, I've read accounts just in general back then, most people were drinking alcohol all the time because water was so bad, and alcohol was the only safe thing to drink. But she was clearly feeding him a lot of alcohol. And an agreement comes up whereas Jack and David Dunning are going to benefit about $1,000 if they'll kill Dick Jennings, if they take him out. And that's what the agreement becomes, and that's what put into place on December 21st, 1818. They're in the Teed residence. James Teed is in the city still, and they see Dick Jennings walking up the road past the house. He's going to check on his lot to see if they're still cutting stuff. That's how miserly he was. He went up every day to check on what they were doing. Well, they see him go by, and they're like, now's our chance. And they give Jack the musket, and Jack goes out. So does David Dunning. And Dunning actually, according to the accounts of Jack, walks next to Dick Jennings, has a conversation with him. Basically asking him if he'll hire him on next year when he gets locked out. Because he really didn't have a problem with Dunning. So they get up to this wood lot, and they're talking, and all of a sudden Jack comes up out of nowhere. And he's got this musket. And this quote here is Dick Jennings saying to him, is it loaded? Kind of an odd question, right? But apparently people didn't walk around with muskets often. Well, Jack tells him, no, it's not. And then he proceeds to pick the musket up and shoot him. And it was probably very close. You know, my guess is from me to, right here. That's how close it would have been. So the musket goes off, he's shot to the head, he falls backwards, but the problem is, he wasn't dead. It was a glancing shot. Well, Jack Hodges has a moment of fear. He just becomes paralyzed. Dunning tells him basically, are you going to indulge in some business and not fulfill your end of the bargain? And he takes the musket from him and beats him in the head until he's dead. And then off they go. They take the piece of the musket, go back to the Teed house and tell Hannah Teed what they've done, and of course she's very happy. Bizarre. And he's left in the field. This is a rough area of where it occurred, on Pine Hill Road. I can't tell you for sure it was anywhere in that area. So, but it was somewhere up in that area near they call it Calamity Corners. It was right up in that area. So, the Teed house was on that road, the woodlot. All right, this is I put together to show you the injuries to Jennings and how it would have happened. So the initial shot actually grazes him and takes off part of his ear, according to the testimony. Knocks him down, doesn't kill him, doesn't even knock him out. So he falls backwards, and that's when Dunning realizes he's still alive. Jack's not doing anything, so he's going to bash him in the head with the butt of the musket. And the fatal wound is actually here, this triangular-shaped wound in the forehead. And that's what the actual cause of death was. The coroner testifies, basically that he could stick his finger in and see the bone and feel the bone. And that he didn't think the gunshot wound was fatal, but that definitely the blow to the head that cracked open his skull was fatal. So back then, the testimony of the medical examiners, was nothing like it is today. He couldn't even remember which ear it was, which side of the face he was shot in. I picked this side just based upon if he were facing him, and if Jack was right-handed and held the musket, he most likely would have been shooting straight on, and that's why he took off that side. That's just an assumption on my part. So Dick Jennings apparently would wander off and not come back for a few days. That was not necessarily an unusual thing. So his family didn't panic when he didn't come home. However, a week goes by, and now they start to think about it. Okay, where is he? He hasn't come back. A search party goes out. They find his body in the woods in that field, right where they left him, along with parts of a musket. And they can clearly tell he didn't die of natural causes. So already now, there's a big stir, because murders were rare. People didn't get murdered back in 1818 in Orange County. So this is all of a sudden, there's a murder amongst us. This is big news, and it's important to find out who did it. And it unravels so quickly, it really does. The coroner comes to it, they convene a jury. That's how they used to do it back then. They get a bunch of citizens who stand around the body, and basically they look at it and determine how they died. And it was pretty clear he died from this big bash in the head. And they determined that he was willfully murdered, and that Jack Hodges did it. They were pretty quick to throw Hodges under the bus. And I don't think they thought anybody would believe Hodges because he was an African American. I think they really thought they could get away with it by pinning it on him. They had sent Jack off to try to get on a boat, originally, in New York City. They thought, well, if he gets on a boat in New York City, out of sight, no one's ever going to hear from him again, we don't have to worry about him running his mouth, drinking. Well, there's a big manhunt, and they chased Jack across the Hudson River, down the Cold Spring, all the way down to New York City, where the person actually talks about how, this Charles Durland, he sees him on a boat in New York City, and he can't get any citizens to help him arrest him. So he basically just sneaks up to Jack and grabs him and says, "You're my prisoner." And Jack says, "For what?" He says, "The murder of Dick Jennings." So can you imagine but there was no cops really back then. You couldn't go tell the police, "Hey, that's my murder suspect." You had to, basically they needed to do it. And then he's brought back to Orange County, and on the way back, they're on a boat. He takes Jack up on the deck to get some fresh air, and he confesses everything. He tells him the whole story. He runs his mouth, gives him detail. Jack never once changes his mind. He tells everything. Gets back to Orange County, Goshen, tells the same story in front of a magistrate. So quickly, everybody else is taken into custody. The whole plot unravels. The Teeds, husband and wife, David Conkling, David Dunning, are all arrested. Jack Hodges, they're all thrown in jail in Goshen. So now you have 5 people arrested for a murder for hire. You can imagine big news today if that were to happen. Even small things today are big news on the when it comes to that. So this is Goshen from 1820, so it would have been contemporary. And this here would have been the courthouse and jail. It wasn't a very big building. There's an interesting article I came upon where in the newspaper they criticized the condition of the jail because citizens had to volunteer to help keep watch because it was in such bad condition they were afraid to escape. So you can imagine it wasn't probably anything like we would consider a jail today. It was probably more of, the basement and the cells. Anybody know where the Orange Inn is, or the old Orange Inn? That's actually built on the foundations of the very first jail, before even this one. And if you go in the basement of there, you can actually see the alcoves where they would have had some of their old cells. So this would have been up a little different, not in the same spot, but again, probably very similar. The courthouse on one floor and these terrible, dank, dungeon-like cells in the basement. That's where they would have kept them. So they get indicted. They go before a grand jury with the testimony, and it doesn't take very long to get an indictment. On February 23rd, the judge seats the grand jury, they hear the evidence, and the next day they unseal the indictment, and this is the charges. Jack Hodges is indicted for murder, willful murder, and so is David Dunning. He's also charged with an accessory before and after. The Teeds and David Conkling, they're all charged as just accessory before and after. However, the distinction in the law really wasn't any different. They were all hangable offenses. They can convict. So even though it wasn't necessarily they weren't charged with murder, but being accessory to murder was just as bad. If you're convicted, you're going to hang anyway. So they might as well have been charged with the murder. And of course, they all plead not guilty. So they go to jail. They're held for trial, and only Jack is the one that really confesses. Dunning denies it all. He denies it actually to the very end, and I'll talk more about that later. He says he saw Jack leave with the musket, but he in no way went with him to that field, and in no way did he beat him to death. And Jack sticks by his story. Nope. He lured him up there basically, and I killed him, and then he beat him in the head. So there's two different stories there, and the one that gets believed is Jack's, ultimately. So we have 5 defendants, and they start on February 23rd, basically, right after the indictments, the next day, and they're tried separately. They're not tried all together. And the first one to go on trial is Jack Hodges. And he has a pretty long trial, and he's found guilty. It's not a big surprise there. And once you're found guilty, obviously he knew what his fate was going to be, that he was going to hang for that. And then the Teeds came up next, and then Dunning and Conkling. And they were right in a row. And they held court back then all day and into the night. There was none of this 9 to 5. There was no lunch breaks because the court officers had an hour break coming to them. The judge, they didn't go off duty at 5. It was, we'll break for supper, and then we'll be back here at 7, and we're going to continue till 11 at night. And then we'll be back here in the morning again. They would do these very long court sessions. So the trials don't last long. They talk about speedy trial. They bang through these things. It's amazing. Today it would never happen. A lot of prominent attorneys are involved in this case that come in, that represent the defendants, that also aid the prosecution. It's big news not only in Orange County, but it's huge news in the country. It's in papers all over the place. Murders, again, they're not very common. Even a murder for hire, extremely uncommon. It was like the first murder for hire in New York. It's still considered that. They used to pack the courthouse, and if you couldn't get in the courtroom, you waited outside the courthouse because you could hear the news, what's going on outside. They wanted to know, they wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to be a part of this. Big news again. Now we just turn on CNN or Court TV and you can watch the trial happening. You don't have to leave your house. But then you had to actually go and do it. The prosecution is headed by this gentleman, Samuel Betts. He was a district attorney. And he was aided, though, by this gentleman, Martin Van Buren, the Attorney General of New York State. He came down to assist in the prosecution. So I think that was what really, when I first heard about this case, was not just that it was this big murder for hire, but Martin Van Buren, the future president, is in Orange County prosecuting a murder case. And I've never heard that. How could people not know that? So I was really fascinated just to learn that little bit of information. But apparently it was very common back then for the Attorney General of a state, especially New York, to go and assist in a capital murder trial. So he did it in other places. He didn't just pick Orange County. He did go other places, but I still think it's pretty fascinating that, this is our future president here. Here's another guy that prosecuted, John Dewar. He came from a very, very prominent family. And interestingly enough, his brother was the judge on that case in Albany. So that was just to me an odd connection. Not only was there case law cited, but his brother was the judge on that case. And he died a couple of years afterwards, so, or not a couple, a little bit longer. Here's one of the defense attorneys for the Teeds, this Jonathan Fisk. So you're a pretty dapper gentleman there. Unfortunately, no matter what they did, they weren't going to get them off of these charges. And back then, of course, you can imagine court proceedings were a lot different. Case law was a lot different, the way evidence was presented, testimony. For example, one of the commissioners, you had a judge, and then you had commissioners of the court that would sit. It was a special court. One of those commissioners was Samuel Seward. Now, you've all heard of the Seward family. His son goes on to be Secretary of State. Well, Samuel Seward was related to Richard Jennings. So he's now sitting in a court position, but he also testifies because he was one of the people that examined the body. So not only is he sitting on the court and related to the deceased, but he also testifies at the trial against him. So you can imagine none of this stuff today would be allowed. It just would be unheard of. If the judge was related to the victim, he would have to recuse himself. But back then, no one thought about this, and I don't think anybody thought to question it. This is just how it was. So the last trial ends in March. Remember, they start at the end of February, the 23rd, 24th, and they go on these marathon sessions and end on March 11th, and all are found guilty. And they're all found guilty individually, remember, because they're tried separately. So it's not like they're all called in at once and said, all right, now you're all guilty. It's Jack Hodges, you're guilty, James Teague, guilty. The only person who doesn't actually get found guilty is Hannah Teague. They allow her to withdraw her plea of not guilty, and she actually pleads guilty to the charge of accessory for murder. Then the prosecutor basically stands up in court and says, we are not going to prosecute this case. We're going to allow her to spend 30 days in jail, but essentially, we don't want her children to be orphaned, because if she's convicted, she'll hang. And in any case, her husband was probably stern and inflexible and basically told her what to do. Because back then, the view of women were a lot different than today. So she's the only one who got off lightly. She did 30 days in jail, she didn't hang. But we'll talk about later, she didn't have a really good outcome anyway. I guess it's karma. The rest of them are all sentenced to death by hanging. They're called up, the death sentence is passed. Jack Hodges, as an African American, had one extra indignity added to his sentence. And he was going to be dissected by the Medical Association of Orange County. So after his death, that was his sentence. Not only are you going to hang, but then they're going to take your body and we're going to send it for dissection. So, kind of barbaric. Now this is the judge. His name was William Van Ness. Another great legal mind of the time. He was a Supreme Court judge of New York State. He came down to preside over the trials. I think he did a great job reading a lot of the transcripts, just from my perspective. One of the legends that goes around with this, and if you read a lot about this case in the more modern accounts, it talks about after sentencing them to death, he harangues them in court for hours. So of course, my image was this judge pointing his finger and talking about eternal damnation. Well, the reality is he didn't harangue them for hours. After he sentences them to hang, he then pleads with them to make peace, basically. That you are going to die, but you have a much greater judgment coming than what we can do to you. So really what I found out wasn't this haranguing judge pointing his finger and yelling at him, but versus much more caring, compassionate, and a genuine concern. Listen, we can only hang you here, but when you get to the next world, wait till they see what they do to you. So you better make peace now. The transcripts definitely contradict it. And also, I was reading his obituary a few years later about how he was eloquent in his manners, his good temper. And I also found a death sentence he pronounced from 1811 where he was very similar. Again, this is a sentence of the law, but now this is me as a Christian imploring you to make peace. So I don't really think he was the bad guy that he was made out to be. So now let's go to April of 1819. And everybody here been to Goshen? Or been through Goshen, driven through Goshen? Okay. Well, on April 10th, Hodges and Conklin receive a pardon. Now, they were never promised a pardon. Hodges was never promised anything for his testimony. In fact, when he's sentenced, the judge then says to him, basically, I want to make sure you've been honest and told the truth, because there's no chance of you pardoning. You're going to go to the next world. Don't go with a lie on your lips. And he affirms again, I told the truth. So the judge is actually the one who writes to the legislature and asks them to commute Hodges' sentence. They end up commuting Conklin and Hodges. And they get 20 years of hard labor and life in prison, actually 21 years. And then hard labor. Back then, prisons were not nice places. And on April 16th, there's a double hanging in Goshen. And this is why I asked who's been to Goshen. The highest estimate is as many as 20,000 people attended. That might be a little high, but still, the newspaper accounts at the time are still in double-digit, thousands. So imagine 20,000 people descending on Goshen for anything today. Let alone back then without public bathrooms, hotels, restaurants, none of those accommodations. Just people pouring in from all over to see this hanging. And it wasn't just the Orange County people. This was a big spectacle. People came from all over to see this happen. There was so many people coming in that the sheriff had to move the gallows from the town green to about a mile outside of town. Somewhere near, I think, where the Catholic school is, John S. Burke. Somewhere off the back road it would have been. With natural hollow, it's described as, so people could gather around it and get a best view of the hanging. This is an actual picture from one of the contemporary publications of the murders. So we can assume one of them is Teed and Dunning. Both men confessed, although Dunning still denies to the end that he killed them. They're baptized. There's a record of them being baptized before the hanging a couple days. This is a big deal. It's a procession. The sheriff at the time had a big responsibility. Number one, he had to hang somebody. 2 people now. But you had to give the people what they want. People weren't turning up just to see a quick hanging. This was ceremonial. There had to be a lot to do about this. There had to be a procession. You had to have the ministers there. As a law enforcement officer, I always try to put myself in his shoes. Because I'm pretty sure when Moses Burnett, that's the guy's name, took office, the last thing he ever thought of was that he'd have to hang somebody. The last hanging had been in the 1700s, Claudius Smith, at the Revolution time. So he wasn't even born yet. So like most people, he probably got elected and thought, the chances of me presiding over a hanging are probably pretty rare. Only now that it was dumped on his lap, he has to do 2. So I always wondered what was really going through his head. The pamphlets at the time, publications, they were big. The newspaper at the time was publishing them. They were selling newspapers and then trying to sell these accounts of the murders, these transcripts. Just amazing. The sheriff was Moses Burnett. He gives an eloquent speech to the crowd after this big, long procession. Basically, this is a solemn occasion. Take this in. What you're seeing is terrible. He turns out to be, he goes on upstate and lives in Syracuse, this really big citizen up there. And so I always wonder, again, I try to identify with him. What was going through this poor guy's mind? They're bad enough they got to hang, but have that dumped on you. 2 hangings, when you probably never thought you'd have to do it in the world. This is an article from the hanging, April 20th, 1819, the Orange County Patriot. A lot of the first-hand accounts that I've been getting come from this newspaper. They seem to have a lot of the most accurate details. And most of the other newspapers that write about this were quoting from the Orange County Patriot. So, tracking it back to this is much more, getting much more information at the source instead of relying upon what others say. So there's a lot of legends now. This is where we get into the legends around the hanging. This is kind of interesting stuff, at least to me it is. The first one is that the condemned were made to kneel under the gallows with the ropes around their necks for 2 hours. Sometimes it's maybe a little bit longer, up to 3 hours. Well, they probably were on the gallows for a couple hours. But it's unlikely the ropes were around their neck because back then, they would just tie the rope to the gallows and it would usually hang maybe to chest height and that would be it. It wasn't a very calculated hanging. It would have been probably a strangulation death. So there wasn't a lot of slack. If you were kneeling down, you'd have to have a lot of slack in that rope. Wouldn't work. So they were kneeling, and there's accounts where the ropes were adjusted and put on afterwards, how the men reacted to that. You know, they go into great detail. How you conducted yourself on the gallows was apparently very important to people. You know, they wanted to know, how did this person act? You know, to think about it that way today, it's like, whoa. So, I don't think that happened. The other myth or legend, if you will, or it's really an inaccuracy, I think, at this point, is that the other men were brought out to the gallows, and all the ceremonies were brought right up to the moment where they're going to be hanged, and then they're told, oh, by the way, you two are reprieved. Well, that didn't happen. They were in jail. I know where this comes from, though, because there was a case around this time where a sheriff actually did that. I think it was near Cooperstown, but he had the guy brought out. They went through the hours worth of ceremony, the sermons, and right up to the moment they put the rope on his neck, he pulled out of his pocket the reprieve. So I think that just evolved just because that would have been big news. In that case, the guy had murdered his daughter, who was very young because she had a speech impediment. If anybody should have hanged, it should have been him. But that's besides the point. So, you know, they were left in jail. They actually found out not too long before that, though. And Hodges was never told about it to the day of the hanging. He thought he was going to hang. And they were doing that because they wanted to make sure he wasn't going to suddenly recant and say, no, wait a minute, I lied. And he didn't. He, right up to the moment he thought he was going to die, he stuck to his story. And on the very end, Dunning did deny it. He even says it from the gallows. I deserve to die, but I did not take that gun and did not bash him in the head. So those are basically how he goes to the gallows. Now, one of the reasons why it probably took 2 hours was because of a sermon. That was a big part of executions back then. This was a big spectacle. You didn't have TV. This was the entertainment the crowd wanted. Reverend Ezra Fisk from the Presbyterian Church in Goshen had been ministering to the gentleman. He delivers this sermon called Sin Finds Out the Criminal. And it's described as being 2 hours long. That's for the kneeling down for 2 hours. And they probably did kneel through it, because that was what they were expected to do and pray. And again, when you think about a 2-hour sermon, you know, I always get this fire and brimstone image of the minister up there telling them that you're going to go to hell, and this is the lesson you better learn, and shaking his fist and pointing his fingers. And well, I managed to track down a copy of this. It took a while. And then I read it, and again, it's a complete opposite. It's this man really imploring them, not haranguing them and saying you're going to be punished, but more of a why this is such an important lesson, and these poor gentlemen, why they ended up the way they are, and how you have to learn from this. Don't follow in these steps. So he turned out to be, I think, a real important aspect of the case because he ministered to them so much that I think he brought them comfort, knowing what was going to happen to him eventually. So he turned out to be a pretty decent character, I think. So the aftermath. This is the legend I think is really fascinating. The legend is that after the hanging, you now have 2 bodies. So they have to be buried. You know, you can't leave them laying around. They didn't have funeral homes, so you couldn't embalm them. The legend is that no cemetery would accept the bodies. Nobody. So finally, and I don't know how if they went around and asked everybody, but a private family, the James Halleck family, said, listen, you can be buried in our cemetery, but not in the walls of the cemetery. You have to be buried on the outside of the cemetery, outside the fence. Which to me must have been, they just didn't want them buried on the consecrated ground. You know, everything inside the fence must have been consecrated. You can be buried right outside our fence, but not in the consecrated ground. And according to legend, that's what happened. Both men were taken and buried outside the walls of the cemetery. Now that cemetery, if anybody from the area wants to go look at it, this is, anybody familiar with this area here? Yep. The Sugar Loaf, this welcome of the...
Yes.
It's up this hill, right up here. Nope, it's open, it's public property. There is a house next door, so you gotta be careful you don't wander onto their property. It's a steep incline on both sides, but you can walk up to it. And this time of the year, you'll probably see the cemetery better because there's no, trees and everything's not growing. That's when I went in the fall. In the summer, you probably wouldn't even know it's there because it'd probably be so overgrown, you probably wouldn't even make it. So, this is probably a good time to go now, is before everything starts to spring in the spring. But up on that hill is a cemetery, and look at the condition. There is a more modern burial there, but most of them are like these stones. There's a lot of those stones which don't even have names on them, just small field stones where you know there's a grave, but there's no marker. And there's just another view of it. There's no way to tell where an old fence would have been. So you can't tell, well, were they buried outside of this area? Are they buried in here? There's just no way to tell that today. It's so overgrown, so run with the weeds, the grass, so poorly maintained that you could never tell.
Did they have markers?
No markers. But they did kind of have a marker in a way, because the rumor is that the night they were buried, the gentleman from the town came out in a party, went up to the cemetery, and drove wooden stakes into the graves, locust poles, and drove them into the ground, through the coffins, into each body. Now, why would someone do that? The only thing, anybody have any guesses on that one?
To keep them in their graves?
Yeah, to keep them in their graves. I mean, even in 1818, people were superstitious, and hanged men were one of the conditions people thought could make you basically come out of your grave and wreak havoc on the living. So there hadn't been a hanging in Orange County in a long time, so you probably have a lot of people with superstitions thinking, you know what, not sure if I like having these hanged men on non-hallowed ground buried that might get up tonight and terrorize my family. So let's drive locust stakes through the ground, because that was always a belief that you could stake the body down. So that's what the legend says was done. Now, if you walk through that cemetery today, you can't see any stakes sticking out of the ground. But 200 years has almost gone by, so there's a good chance that if there were stakes, they would have just rotted away by now. But there are accounts that up until even the late 1800s, those stakes still being visible. And actually, there's a story about a guy riding by in a carriage with his daughter, and his daughter asked, "What are those stakes?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm glad you asked." Because, when James goes on to tell the whole story. "Remember what I tell you," he says to her. So, and I'm sure that's part of where these legends filtered down from. This may or may not be completely true, but it's still a really interesting legend. And there has to be some basis in truth, so that's where I'm going to leave that right now. So now let's see what happens to our other unfortunate people. We know what happened to the other two. And for them, they kind of got off easy compared to Hannah and the others going to jail. Hannah kind of goes crazy. She ends up living out towards Newburgh, loses her mind, and in August of 1823, they find her floating dead in the Hudson River. It's a suicide. People had seen her walking in to the river on July 30th, just walking into the river. So apparently she drowned herself. That's what the determination was. And that's all that's really mentioned of her. It never says where she's buried. That's it. Never mentions what happens to her children. She just kind of disappears into history, which is what a lot of these people ended up doing. David Conkling fares a little better. Remember, he comes from a good family, and his wife comes from a very good family, the Knights. He's a veteran of the War of 1812, I found out. So it kind of makes it sad that he ended up in this terrible, predicament. But his wife stands by her man. She stood by her man. There's a song about that, I think, but not about that. But originally, him and Hodges go off to Newgate Prison in Manhattan, which was the first state prison. Terrible place. It was deplorable conditions. On any given day, it was double the population of what it was supposed to have. And he ends up being transferred to the new prison when it's built, called Mount Pleasant, which is now Sing Sing. So the original Sing Sing prison was called Mount Pleasant. So yeah, nice name for Mount Pleasant, right? The original cell house is still there, but it's just a shell. The original 1820-something cell block. Everything else has been modernized. And that's where he ends up. He's at Mount Pleasant. He spends a lot of time there. And the legend says, according to the modern accounts, that he was pardoned after 13 years. So I dug into that and found out that he was indeed pardoned on January 16, 1834. Now the local accounts say he was pardoned because he was stricken with rheumatism. Now it doesn't say that in the pardon, it doesn't say why he was pardoned, it says he was pardoned. Now the other legend is he died a few years later. Like he gets out and he's so stricken with pain that he only lives a couple of years and dies anyway. Or did he? I'm not going to tell you that because I have a few surprises. Not the biggest question of the century, but I got to have something to entertain you here. And the other legend that kind of pops up around the Conklings is that they changed the year of his death on his gravestone to be 1810. And that they did that intentionally so people wouldn't associate him with being the same man that was convicted and sent to prison for murder. And I'm not telling that one yet. There's also the rumor that the family changed the last name to Conklin to avoid the shame. Well, the name did become Conklin, or Conklin from Conklin. But now, is that proof they were trying to cover it up? I don't know. My last name, Worden, I have family members. We are W-O-R-D-E-N. They are W-O-R-D-I-N. And they're I-N because the E, when it was handwritten on the birth certificates, was misinterpreted as an I. So, back then, changing names seemed to be a lot more common. If you go to some cemeteries with Conklins and Conklins, they'll be buried in the same area. And some Conklins became, Conklin from Conklin, some Conklins kept Conklin, so I don't know if they really tried to cover it up, but it's possible. There's just no way to tell you that definitively. But the name did change to Conklin. Now this is what Newgate Prison looked like in Manhattan. Down towards, I think, Greenwich Village is where it would have been. So this would have been right in the middle of Manhattan. Of course, it's 1818, so it's not like we think of it. And that's where the term going up the river comes from. Because if you were convicted, in order to get you there, they had to sail you around and up the river from the courts. Now that's a really bad image of Sing Sing. It came out blurrier than I thought. But you can see the prisoners wearing those striped uniforms. Prison in 1818, 1820, terrible conditions. You weren't allowed to talk. You couldn't conversate, with other prisoners, with guards. Any infraction was met with beatings because they believed that if you allowed even the slightest inmate infraction to get away with it, it would lead to a rebellion. So the smallest things would lead to these terrible beatings, solitary confinement, no talking. So you can imagine these were not nice conditions. Not to mention it was hard labor. The inmates had to build the jails, the prisons. So Conklin didn't have a great life in prison. So it's possible he got out and he was sick because of the conditions of the food. Hodges seems to fare the best amongst everybody. He also goes to Newgate. He starts out there. It was the only prison at the time. And he's later transferred to the new prison at Auburn. Auburn Correctional Facility is still there today, the same prison, up by Canandaigua, New York. So he's sent up when it's opened up in the 1820s. He's one of the first inmates transferred. He doesn't want to move. He becomes a powerful example of redemption. Who is familiar with the whole story of how Jack becomes redeemed? A few people? Okay. This, to me, is the most fascinating aspect of this story, other than the whole criminal aspect as a police officer. He learns how to read and becomes deeply religious in jail. He learns to read from the Bible. Because when he got to Auburn, there was a new system of thought going that basically said, listen, these people might get out someday. Keeping them locked up in a cell by themselves and not talking to anybody might not be the best way to rehabilitate them. But let's rehabilitate them with penitence, hence penitentiary, the Bible. Let them read the Bible. Let them reflect upon what they've done wrong, and maybe they'll come out better people. Jack was one of those first people to sort of get into this type of a line of thinking. I always joke around that he was the first person that went to prison that really found religion. Everybody finds religion in jail, they joke. Well, he really did find religion in jail. He learned how to read. He's an exemplary inmate. He's not a problem. He's treated well by the staff. The staff likes him, the guards, the prison warden. The clergy that come to visit him are amazed by him, his life story. They know where he comes from. They know what he's done. But yet they see this powerful redemption going on with Jack, learning the Bible, becoming religious, and just becoming a better person. He also retells his story to different people. Different clergy members want to hear it. He never changes his story. So there's still to this day a conflict between what he says, which is that Dunning was there and helped me, and Dunning's right to his dying moment saying, nope, I wasn't there, I'll never be in with it. So I guess we'll never know the exact truth on that, because we can't go back and talk to the other person. So there's Auburn, back when it was made. It really hasn't changed much. If you ever see pictures of it, the main building, it's got that statue of a soldier on top of it, a copper soldier. If you Google it, it's pretty interesting. It's been there since, I think, the 1800s. Right, Hodges has quite a few stories around him. Some are really interesting. The first is he's released after about 15 years. which we know the other guy got out after 13, so it's probably not unreasonable. He gets out actually even sooner. He's out in February of 1829. So you figure he did less than 10 years, because he would have went to prison in April of 1819, and then he's being pardoned, about 10 years later. So that was what that redemption did. It got him out of jail earlier, I think, because they had seen such a transformation. He was older. He was about 50 years old at the time he was convicted. So they also probably look at the fact that this is an elderly gentleman. He's probably not likely to go out and kill anybody else. He's probably not likely to live much longer. It's also said that he resided with William Seward, Secretary of State. Well, I can't find any evidence of that. However, he was associated with their family up there. So William Seward now would have been a nephew of the murdered victim. So even after his release, Jack Hodges had some connection to the family of the murderer, or the victim of the murder, which is just weird, that they all end up in the same area. And he changes his name to Jacob, maybe to get away from being Jack. Well, he does go by the name Jacob after the release, so I don't know if that was intentional or just, he was also called John by some, Jack. Was it just, that's what they called him? This is one I really like. He became a well-regarded member of the community. Now, how many convicted murderers usually get out of prison and are embraced by the community to the point where people want to visit them? People of high standing now want to visit them. And this is a time, 1829, when African Americans were still legally being enslaved in a lot of the United States. And had, even in New York State where they were free, did not enjoy the same rights or status in society. So he was a really contradiction at the time, because he was the opposite. People sought him out to see him. People came to see him. They wanted to talk to him. They wanted to hear him talk about the Bible. He would minister to families. They would send him out to troubled families to talk to them, to try to get them to see the Bible. Like, look at where I came from. You can do this. His funeral, when it would happen, was like a huge affair. Largely, tons of people, well-to-do citizens turning out to attend his funeral and sermon. It's also said he was the subject of a lot of books and articles, and that's true too. This is one of them. It says Black Jacob, a Monument of Grace. It's all about his life. It's a very interesting book because he talks a lot about the murder in this book. So it was a great insight for me to read him talking about it in much more detail so many years later. This is written long after he's out of jail. He was also written about in tons of magazine articles, all kinds of journals. There was a prison discipline society who was advocating prison reform, who used him as an example in a lot of different articles. Like, look, this is why we should be helping people, because of the redemption power of this. And in fact, I caught a little blurb when I was digging through an old journal where I think it was Massachusetts, decided to not send money to the Prison Discipline Society because they were using him as an example of why capital punishment might not be a good answer. So they didn't like the fact that they were going around saying, maybe you shouldn't kill people because look, you can still be redeemed, so they decided, well, we're not going to send you our whatever money that we were going to normally give you. Which is so crazy today. So this is the biggest one associated with him, that there's a big monument in his memory in Canandaigua, New York. Well, he did die, so everybody dies. He died February 16, 1842. And he is buried in the Old Pioneer Cemetery in Canandaigua, New York. And there you can see, it's his tombstone. Now remember, he's not from Canandaigua. He's from Auburn State Prison, released from prison and settles in Canandaigua. Is an African American, and in 1842, his status in the community was such that this is what they erected for him. Wow. And originally, this plaque was not on there. Originally it was engraved, but it was wearing down, so at some point they preserved it. But it says, Jacob Hodges, an African Negro, born in poverty and ignorance, early tempted to sin by designing in wicked men, once condemned as a felon, converted by the grace of God in prison, lived many years a converted and useful Christian, died February 1842 in the faith of the gospel, about 80 years of age. So we go from the very beginning of the story to this terrible, brutal murder, and you fast forward all these years later to the one little bit of redemption that comes out of the whole story, and that's Jacob Hodges. So To me, that's a nice way to end the story. You know, it's not like, all right, he died in prison, he died of this, and it's like there is some hope. My goal in looking at all this, and this is just the tip of it, there's so much more that you could talk about this. I could probably talk for hours about just different aspects of this case, the trials. But I wanted to there's so many accounts, and they're not always accurate. Even the accounts from the time, there's a lot of inaccuracies. So I've gone backwards in time and just tried to dig out as many sources that I can. I've got, I think, over 40 original sources now. Which, if you can imagine trying to track down documents from the 1800s, it's not easy. And it's a lot of begging libraries to make copies, and historical societies. Because apparently some places get a hold of documents but don't want anybody to see them. Which makes me wonder, why do you preserve them in the first place? If they're going to sit on a shelf or in a vault that no one ever is going to access. I wanted to get to the real sources of the legends. Number one, are they true? And if they're not true, where did they come from? You know, because even if they're not true, there still had to be a source of that legend. It just didn't spontaneously generate. So that's been one of my goals, and I think I've gotten to the source of a lot of them, especially that stake in the ground and the burial thing. But I'm not going to give that up yet. Again, it's been more than 3 years of research, dozens of sources, newspaper articles, and just, this was a well-written about case. Even in the 1830s, books were publishing chapters about it. You know, crime was a big thing, anthologies of these notorious murderers. And this was one of the stories that would pop up. Not necessarily 100% accurate, and then of course, what happens when one source is inaccurate and people start copying off that source, right? It's like you give them a telephone, the next source, it just keeps getting worse and worse. Even in the Orange County history books, they got it wrong in one of the books. One of the big Orange County history volumes. It's like one of those definitive, this is the history of Orange County, gets it wrong. Because they relied upon information that was just inaccurate. They had no way of knowing that at the time, but in hindsight, that's what it was. So that's really been my goal, and it should be available soon. Oops. That's my website. If you have web, you can go on therealcrimescenes.com. It's also on the piece of paper I handed out. If you didn't get one, see me. I got tons of them, so feel free to take them. And if you get your name on the list, I can email you with updates. And like I said, this is just a taste of the whole case. This was me trying to figure out what can I boil down for the next 30, 40 minutes of presentation without either boring everybody or giving the whole case away. So that's it. Any questions? Around Calamity Corner. That's where the murder would have been. I just can't find any documentation that says Conkling's lived on Conklingtown Road, the Teeds lived right there on Pine Hill. So everybody was relatively close. Yes?
Maybe I missed it, but where did the original $1,000 reward come from? Who had that kind of money then?
They apparently, when they killed him, or were going to kill him, Teed claimed to be able to get this money. So I'm thinking he thought he was going to reclaim the lot and then be able to sell whatever. I think they grew grain on it and also cut wood. But I think his thought was, I'm going to resell the lot, I'll be able to sell my wood, I'll be able to sell the grain, and then I'll be able to give you 500, you 500 for killing.
Where is Richard Jennings buried?
Don't know. Can't find them.
How big was the lot?
Doesn't say.
Oh.
It doesn't say. It just describes it as a lot. But I'm guessing it had to be a nice piece of land to fight over. You know, if it was like the size of this room, I can't imagine anybody going through all that trouble to sue back and forth in court. But I think it had to be a sizable piece of property that, especially for him to be so concerned about it, to walk up every day and see what's happening.
Was Jennings related to Samuel Seward or to his wife? I thought it was the wife.
It was to the wife. So it was through, it's a family member relation. Yeah.
And which history is the one that has it incorrect, so I don't look at that one?
I think it's Meagers. I think it's Samuel Eagers, is it? There's 3 different ones. One of them doesn't even mention it. It's not even mentioned anywhere in the whole history book. It's like, whoa, how's that not like possible? And the other one is just a blurb about who made the rope to hang him. Very interesting. It's a who's who of Orange County in 1818. And that just sort of everybody sprung from that. Yes?
Have any of the participants, other than the main participant, written diaries or any other analysis, like any of the jurors or the judge or the people who were there at the hanging?
We have,
independent recollections of their own?
There's one newspaper letter to the editor where a gentleman writes in and says he attended it, and basically the speech of the sheriff was so eloquent, can you please print that? And then, of course, the newspaper prints it. I came across a reference where somebody in a diary wrote about a first-hand account, but I can't track down that person's family. Because it's going back, I can't even tell you how far back this reference is. I'm thinking from the early 1900s to mid-1900s. But it claims that, it's a William Conklin, everybody has a family member, William Conklin, who published his memoirs, something about my 70 years of his life. He says it writes about it, a first-hand witness account of the hanging. I just can't find it. It might not exist. You know, it might have just been a small pamphlet that he put out and it's lost to history. Yes, sir.
You were mentioning that certain things would be allowed today in court because of familiarity between people and what have you. But in those days, that was the norm.
Yeah.
Because people came from small villages and towns, and the people that would be on the jury would be somebody went to church with them and
Yeah.
whatever. So, and that goes back even to English law.
Yeah, there was no way to avoid that stuff. And it didn't really change because I'm working on a case from 1877 from where I live near Deer Park, New York, where the coroner that examined the body was then the magistrate that held the preliminary hearing to see if they should hold the guy for trial. It's like, wait a minute. You know, today that would, you know, the coroner having a hearing, but he was a judge, he was also the coroner. So I think it's just like you said, there were small towns and you knew everybody and there was no way to avoid a conflict. You know? Yes?
Were Ezra and John Fisk related? Ezra was the minister and then John was a lawyer, it's the same name.
I don't have any records of being related.
Yeah,
Yeah, I always thought that was interesting. I have a drawing of Ezra too, and I look at them when they side by side, and I'm like, you know, can you really go by that? I mean, is that what really the Jonathan Fisk looked like? You know, that's a drawing, it's someone's, you know, opinion, but it's interesting. Yes, ma'am?
Was there no need for evidence, like I remember at the beginning you said there was part of a musket that was found, was there no need to analyze that because they had a confession?
I think they showed it in court, but it was just, here's the musket piece, and it corroborated Jack's statement that the musket end broke and that this is the piece. So, yeah, back then there was no forensics they didn't exist. And, you know, the examination of the wound would consist of sticking your finger in and feeling around and saying, oh yeah, there's that coming. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it wasn't until 100 to 150 years later that we had prison reform in terms of conditions and changes also in the expectations of what rehabilitation might occur in people. Have you any indication that this case was cited years later for any of those reasons?
I haven't found any.
Just wondering.
Yeah, but that's interesting because it may have been, you know, over the process. I just never came across a reference to that. But that's interesting. I might have to look a little more at that. Yes?
You said, that, if I'm not mistaken, you said the jail is not where the original jail was, the
No.
foundation of the Orange Inn. Where was that jail?
This one, from what I can gather, is where you know the old county clerk building in Goshen? It's the old clerk's
1841
building?
courthouse?
No, actually it says county clerk on it.
Oh, okay,
It's
on the
real
other
old-
side.
Yes.
the street.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where it seems like the descriptions I have, later descriptions say it was built on the site of the jail. But it also talks about the previous jail, being on the other side. So, and that's, then you have the 1841 courthouse across the street. Does someone else have a question? Yes.
Earlier, at the very beginning, you mentioned the Cherry Hill estate in Albany. Is that case something that you think you might be publishing on as well?
Yeah, that one is pretty much done. Like this case, I'm pretty much doing the research, only I have one loose end, and that is I'm trying to find where they buried the guy's grave. I think I figured out the cemetery. I just have to drive down to Yorktown and look for it. So it's just one of those, I gotta take a day trip down to Yorktown. But then that'll be also, and there's a lot. And that's a fascinating case, because in that case, you know, the Hodges gets spared for testifying, and in that case, Jesse Strang was the guy's name. Well, he goes to testify against his co-defendant, and like, not so fast. And the judge in that one, and I'll probably be back another day to talk about it, says basically, well, she was from a good family, so I'm sure that played a big part of it. And also, listen, you're guilty, we know you're going to hang, and what's the point of her hanging also, basically? And if we give you a pardon, why should she hang when you deserve to hang too? So the logic was just twisted. But that's where that whole judge writing this big, long dissertation on why he decided the way he did. blurb about this case, and from there it just becomes madness.
Did Van Buren write anything?
I can't find
As
anything.
this-